Hey everybody. So call this an indie zombie review. Quick little review. I'm going to try and make this quick. So a new indie horror psychological game came out a little while ago for the PS4. It's also on Steam about sometime last year. It's called The Town of Light. It's got rave reviews from Eurogamer, a bunch of other places I've never heard of. The reviews on Steam are kind of mixed, but a lot of them are positive. And there's a trailer for it that I'm going to show here that shows all the glowing reviews for it. Call it a masterpiece of horror and say that it's different, that it's interesting, so forth. These are my thoughts on it.
I was 16 years old, and I was afraid, always afraid, a fear that wore me down. I needed help. Screams, desperation. Loneliness. It wasn't fear anymore. It was madness. And when you're mad, you cease to exist.
First of all, it's a walking sim, so it's not much of a video game. So there's that. At least it was only $20, so it's a cheap walking sim, and it's got very small notions that can make it a game in terms of there's really felt like one scene of puzzle solving. And then the rest of the time, you're just wandering from place to place, going to a particular room, looking for something, getting it, and then progressing the story. That's it, with very little input from you, aside from one. And I want to try to avoid spoilers, but in order for everything to make sense. So, the story is that supposedly you are a former inmate of an insane asylum, and you go back there, and there's a lot of stuff that just doesn't make any sense that happens progressively over the game. And as you go there and you're visiting, and and the place is run down, so there's nobody there, and you're finding old journal pieces, having old flashbacks, and remembering stuff that you may have forgotten because your character obviously has mental issues. And see, what kind of gets me is that it's a psychological horror. It's certainly that, but it doesn't do a whole lot with that side of it. In that, like, the most that the game gets into when it's psychological horror is some of the flashbacks. Like, one moment that I had that actually really made it interesting for me was at one point you're walking and you can't, turn around. And you're being forced down to walk this corridor. And when you get to the wall, the room shifts. And all of a sudden that wall just goes down and becomes the floor, and so on. And that was actually pretty interesting. But then it doesn't do that again, ever. The rest of the time when you're in these flashbacks, it's just this vertigo effect meant to disorient you. Which it kind of does, but it's not really scary. And I will admit, when I was first walking into the insane asylum, a dark, spooky, abandoned place, it's all dark and everything, yeah, that was pretty intimidating, but Then, after about a half hour or so of when you're first playing it, and you realize that there's not going to be any threats, there's not going to be any big scary jump scares, which is nice for once, that it's actually trying to scare you with its ambience and what the game is actually about. But that really didn't scare me. So, it could have done a lot more with the atmosphere. It could have done a lot more with the flashbacks if it really wanted to scare me. And ultimately, a lot of things don't start making sense. For one thing, especially with how the game ends. And this game took me probably about 3.5 hours, or maybe 4 hours, for me to get through and beat. And the game also has, I guess, a moral decision choice a couple of times. It only happens when your character is actually reading through her medical charts and actually finding out some stuff about herself. And when she starts going into information, she starts talking to herself, and suddenly you have to make a choice about these different statements. And depending on what you choose, though it really didn't seem to make a difference because she would continue to read the file, though there was a point at the end of the game when she didn't want to read the file anymore. I wasn't sure if it was because I made wrong decisions. So you would get these different results depending on how you answered. And it would do one thing which I thought was meaning for positive, and I think I know what the game was going for with this, where it was that when you chose correctly, it was her no longer wanting to be antisocial or distance herself or feeling alone or anything like that, her being, one with the crowd, and one with society. And then if you got it wrong, I guess, at one point she would be crossed out and turning away from the crowd, or the crowd would be crossed out, or whatever. So different meanings, different interpretations. I don't know, but it only happened a couple of times, but didn't make much sense. And again, like, a lot of the different choices can either come off, I guess, as trying to be helpful or perhaps being too ignorant to what's going on. I don't know, it was just a little too hard to try to understand for me anyway. And so supposedly this character, I guess, had been going through some form of abuse in her life, which was the reason why she was committed, and I guess because of her behavior. But then certain revelations start coming up, which doesn't really make much sense to everything else that we had heard or discovered or anything like that. And at one point you're going around and you're finding or collecting journal pages or parts of your past, which are supposed to make more sense as the story goes on. But with how the game ends, it really doesn't make any sense. And the one, interesting moment that the game had was, and it gives you this hint at one point when you're walking through this ward, and this is not a very big institution either. I mean, when you first walk in, it's just these two stories, but then there's this other building that you have to walk to as well, and then this other part of the grounds that you have to walk to as well. I'd also like to point out, too, that there seems to be some odd things that are going on with the sound as well, and just a few other things that I noticed, like for example, how when you first are walking in, and there's this little park area that you can walk into, and there are a few things that you can interact with, like the swing set, where you can actually sit down and through your own momentum, through the controller, you can start actually swinging yourself, which was pretty cool. And you can go on the slide, but yet when you step on the rusted metallic steps, it doesn't make a sound effect, nor does it when you slide down the slide. yeah. Um, the, so there was that. There was, but that was just at the beginning. And you can interact with stuff. You can open doors and turn on lights after you turn on the generator. You have a flashlight with you as well. Of course, the flashlight is dim. It's meant to, ooh, your flashlight isn't very bright. Ooh, you can't see everything. Ooh, scary. But again, after a half hour of playing, well, there's no real threat. So after a while, I just realized that, well, I would like to be able to see where I'm going. But eventually, that just doesn't start to mean anything at all. Because it's just a linear path at one point. And sorry, I'm still trying to collect my thoughts as I go through this. And I'm wondering if I shouldn't spoil too much, but I'll put a warning in here if I'm going to spoil it or not. The one really cool moment that I was going to get to, in the game, gives you a hint about this, where I didn't know what I was supposed to do next, but the game was talking about how when the darkness comes, that's when everything happens or something happens. And it's in one of the rooms in this part of the ward. And it's got, this really weird, pretty creepy looking painting on it. And I realized, like, if I close the doors and then I close the shutters to the windows and turn off my flashlight, then everything's dark, and then it gets progressively darker, and then the game continued on with its story, and it kept going. And it's like, oh, well, okay, that was kind of cool. Again, that was the second most interesting part about this game. And that was it. And I will give the game points for trying to do a interesting story about mental illness, especially during a time when nobody really knew that much about mental illness or really how to treat it. This game is supposed to take place during the 1930s and 40s. And it's a pretty interesting time period to try and, do this type of a story on. And the game also, likes to talk about and claim how, this is semi-true events, may have taken place at a real place at one point in time that just no longer exists and stuff like that. And, But, one other thing that I wanted to mention about some of the sound, is it weird how when you're walking through the corridors and yet when you're walking around outside on the concrete path, it's the same sound effect? That it's a very echoey sound effect? Yeah, that's just not right. And the game crashed on me once, near the end of the game. Game just crashed on me. Of course, that's the only time that it did that, but yeah, gotta give you, a mark against you for that. And the game kind of ends in a way that really just doesn't make any sense. It does get pretty disturbing at the end where, you learn that the patient never left the asylum, or was certainly never going to, because their mother died at one point of an illness, and she didn't have any other family.
Discharge is impossible are explained.
I will also give the game points for getting pretty creepy and disturbing with some of its artwork, in terms of where it starts talking about how apparently at one point the patient may have been raped either by somebody working at the institute or something. I mean, it's not really made clear. I mean, we kind of learned about that through a flashback. That this person who I thought at first was a guard, of course, I can't show you the clip because it shows nudity, and well, I don't want to get into trouble on YouTube, so I'll only show little parts of it, what I can show here. But yeah, and it's like, wow, okay, well, that was creepy and certainly disturbing. And anyway, as for the rest of the ending, after losing her mother, and finding out that she's not leaving. She tried to kill herself twice, once by hanging herself and then another time by suffocating herself while she was, handcuffed to her bed. And eventually the doctors decided that it was best to give her a lobotomy. And they show the whole process of it too. And, if I had to watch it, I'm sorry, you have to watch it too. And at first, I wondered if we were going to have to watch it via first person, and I wasn't sure entirely what was happening, and then I realized very slowly, oh god, this is actually happening. That is the most disturbing moment in the entire game. And then it continues on, and then it ends. Talking about how she's never leaving, how she seemed to improve and seemed to be okay, but she, didn't have a life, wasn't going to have a life. She once was a child, now she's an adult, and her life's just kind of been thrown away. And then that's how the game ends. 4 hours, $20, not really that scary at all. Not much of a masterpiece, in my opinion. The story is okay, but because of the ending, nothing really makes a lot of sense. So, the whole time that you're exploring this abandoned place, this abandoned hospital, but she never left. How is she there, then? Or is this all just going on inside her head? And I mean, what really would have made this game better would have been, well, for one thing, in order to have, more player input, pretty much, would have been, maybe if instead of, answering those questions or giving out those statements at one point, maybe have some more puzzles be involved in order to try and access, more parts of the asylum and stuff like that. Or, or make it seem like that you're actually having to follow somebody. I mean, you actually do have to follow something at some point where the game wants you to follow a hearse, down to the graveyard. Apparently, yeah, that just kind of pops out of nowhere and you see it in the distance. Of course, I didn't see it the very first time that this occurrence happened. I saw it when I went back to the game later. So, yeah. And the character models look a little bit derpy, but they look okay. I mean, for what they are. I mean, it's a $20 indie game, so I can forgive it for that. The story is really not that impressive for me. I will admit, at least the ending was not something that I predicted. It was something that my friend Andy predicted, actually, when I told him about it. That he was, after I told him about it, that he kind of figured that maybe it's going to turn out that she never left. And yeah, she didn't, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense in terms of the story. And, and that's kind of the problem with a lot of these walking sims, is that, for them to be sold as a game is kind of bullshit. Because in order for it to be a game, That would require input from the player actually doing something instead of just kind of sort of interacting with this story, meaning walk from point A to point B to activate story C. That's not very good for a game. That can be kind of boring, especially when it's a walking sim that's a slow walking sim at times too. And especially one that likes to claim to be a psychological horror, and it's not that scary, and it doesn't really do anything with the themes of what it's talking about. I mean, like, for example, if this game played with your mind, a lot more, and, what was so funny to me was how, like all those review scores that were coming up and everything, talking about how this is the most thrilling psychological horror, blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking, you haven't played a whole lot of video games, have you? I mean, you haven't played Silent Hill or the Resident Evil series? I mean, Silent Hill is a lot more of a psychological horror. Or hell, how about Eternal Darkness? I mean, hell, there's a whole system in that game that messes with your head all throughout it in terms of your insanity. And that did more with that than this game did. If the game played mind games with you during flashbacks or made you think that you were having hallucinations, like if you were... Because there are quite a few points where you're just walking down hallways and weird stuff starts happening, but that's really it. Nothing else. Nothing really all that terrifying until you get down to the end of the hallway and then just activates more story. If, say, for example, you were walking down an endless hallway that was just endless, and then you turn around and there's a wall all of a sudden in front of you, and then you turn back around and there's another wall, and you just keep turning and turning until finally there's a door, and then you keep progressing and you're having to walk through a labyrinth or something, and maybe it's a puzzle that you have to try and solve. That would have been a lot more interesting than this. That was just a walking sim and nothing more, with maybe one element that was a puzzle and then this standardized question, statement, answer thing that really didn't make any sense. And again, like, because of the way that the story ends, doesn't make a whole lot of sense in terms of what was going on. Why were you at this abandoned asylum if you never left? Or are you a ghost now? Bottom line, I can't recommend this game. I can't. If you want a better story that's got more gameplay, there's some much better games to play. I never did play Outlast, and that was another one that took place in an insane asylum. And that was survival horror. Of course, that, had the thing of, like, you can't actually fight the threats. You have to run away from the threats. But, yeah. But there are a lot better titles to play than that. Well, anyway, everybody, I hope that you've enjoyed my review on the Town of Light. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Did you guys play it? Did you like it? Did you not? Explain why, or please give this video a like, subscribe if you enjoyed it. I would really appreciate it. Follow me on Twitter. Check out my channel. Check out more videos. Support me on Patreon. Links are in the description below. See you guys next time.